Welcome, and thank you for joining our webinar today, Measuring the Financial Impact of a Third-Party Assessment, featuring Michael Rasmussen. Michael is an internationally recognized GRC analyst and pundit at the GRC 2020 Research. We're also joined today by Scott Lang, Prevalent's very own Vice President of Product Marketing. You'll be hearing from him a bit later towards the end of the hour. My name is Peter Schumacher. I'll be your webinar host today. I've got a couple housekeeping items to cover before we get officially started. So first of all, this is a reminder that all attendee lines are muted, and we do that in an effort to cut down on background noise, especially with many of us working from home offices. In an effort to keep this session interactive, we do invite you to submit your questions using the Zoom console. Time permitting, at the end of the hour, we'll address those questions in an official Q&A section. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we plan to deliver that recording to your inbox tomorrow morning. I know you didn't join to hear my voice, so at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Michael. Michael, thanks so much, and please take it away.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Michael Rasmussen of GRC 2020 Research. GRC is Governance, Risk Management, and Compliance. And my job is research, so I see my competitors are Gartner and Forrester. I actually spent 7 years at Forrester Research and then left Forrester at the end of 2007 and been 13 years on my own as an independent research analyst. So in my job, it's my opportunity to be able to research and understand what keeps organizations up at night in context of governance, risk, and compliance, and how they go about solving those problems with strategy, process, and particularly technology. Now, in that research, what I find most often is that a lot of organizations are struggling in the area of third-party risks. Vendors, suppliers, outsourcers, service providers, contractors, consultants, brokers, agents, dealers, intermediaries. It goes on and on and on. That's where I see a lot of the challenges within governance, risk, and compliance is to understand that, the organization goes on and in a web of relationships and transactions, and we have to manage that. So today we're going to talk about measuring the financial impact of a third-party assessment. How do we go about understanding the risk reduction in value that an individual assessment brings to the organization of a third party? And we'll actually talk about that broadly in a qualitative fashion, but then we'll get into a specific model around data breach assessments related to data breaches and the risk reduction there at the end of this. So measuring the financial impact of a third-party risk. Now, today's business is dynamic. It's changing minute by minute, second by second. There's global relationships, there's transactions, the risks are changing, geopolitical risks, industry standards and practices, environmental risks. I mean, look at COVID-19. It was a few months ago that I wrote a blog on COVID-19 called The Dominoes of Risk. What starts as a health and safety risk has this cascading impact on third-party risks and operational resiliency of supply chains and vendors and outsourcers and service providers as the world shuts down. It has had an impact on third-party risks in the context of bribery and corruption. As supply chains are constrained, there's greater risk that some employees going to bribe a foreign government official to expedite their goods through customs with all the backlog in customs and import and export happening right now. There's increased risk of harassment and discrimination that we see around us right now, particularly in the work from home environment. And people are working from home. They're a little more lax in their communications, and they're saying things they shouldn't be saying on Zoom calls and meetings like this. And it crosses the lines with things that they wouldn't say in the corporate office, to IT security risks because people are working from a home office. We have this challenge of the Internet of Things, not only in the corporate office, but now in the home office with everybody working from home, where, the TV behind me is connected to the internet. My blender downstairs in the kitchen is connected to the internet. My light sockets are connected to the internet. And if one of these has a Trojan horse or vulnerability, it can expose me as a third party to many other companies, the data that's on my laptop, the connections I have to those companies. It's an interconnected risk environment. And as I was illustrating with, COVID-19 has this cascading domino impact that impacts all these other risks, including IT security risks and bribery and corruption and everything else. And we have to be able to see these risk relationships. So today, organizations are navigating chaos. I wrote a paper on this last October, published in Enterprise Risk Magazine by the Institute of Risk Management in London. it's all in this focus of the chaos of business today. And this is before COVID-19. So this is last October, nearly a year ago, that it was published. And COVID-19 just illustrates this point even more, that we have to be able to navigate the chaos of business, see the interconnectedness of risk, keep up with regulations, as well as a changing business and third-party environment. We can be very knowledgeable about the law and regulation, but if the third party hasn't changed, or our process hasn't changed, and our due diligence hasn't changed to address that, we're not compliant. So we have to keep all this change in sync, which is a particular challenge. Now, the physicist Friedrich Capra stated, the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they're interconnected and interdependent. Now, the physicist here is talking about biological ecosystems. Go into the woods or park by your house. You can see the interconnectedness of nature all around you and biological ecosystems. Well, we have the interconnectedness of business right now with third-party relationships from vendors and suppliers and outsourcers and service providers and contractors and consultants and brokers and agents and dealers and intermediaries. We need to be able to see this interrelationship of risks and do proper assessments on these third parties to see the big picture of risk, from bribery and corruption risk to IT security and privacy risks to operational resiliency and continuity risks, to be able to see each of those relationships and the risks they bring. Now, to illustrate this even further, the English poet John Donne said, "No man is an island entire of himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." Let's replace that word man with the term organization. No organization is an island entire of itself. Every organization is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. We have an interconnected risk environment. It was just a few months ago, I was talking to a large global automobile manufacturer. And they were challenged because they're trying to readdress their enterprise risk management program and their enterprise compliance management program, because they're realizing that their risks go across business boundaries. We've re-engineered and outsourced so many processes and manufacturing and services in the organization that you cannot define business by brick and mortar business and employees anymore. Business is defined by this cascading web of relationships that crosses all these different business boundaries. And in this large global automobile manufacturer, it's how do we address third-party risk as an integrated component of our enterprise risk and compliance program? Because what used to be seen as an insider risk of risk and compliance now transcends across vendors and suppliers and outsourcers and service providers and more. As another large global European bank I was talking to this past year, they're looking at having everybody in their data centers. Now, let's stop right there. Who's in a bank's data center? Most of the people in a large bank's data center are not employees. They're outsourcers, service providers, contractors, and consultants. Most of the people in this bank's data center are not employees. They're looking at every individual in the data center going through the same policies and training, particularly on GDPR, that employees do. No organization is an island. It's an interconnected environment of business out there and relationships and transactions. And we need stronger assessments to be able to manage in that context. We need to understand who our third parties are in this context, to be able to effectively manage the contractors and consultants, suppliers, vendors, outsourcers, service providers, brokers, agents, dealers, intermediaries, and more, and be able to properly assess the risk and see that 360-degree contextual view of risk of each relationship and the interconnectedness of relationships on the business. This becomes critical. So I tell organizations, I do a third-party risk management workshop around the world when there's no COVID-19 and we can all travel and go to workshops. Just in this last February, before COVID-19 hit, I did my third-party risk workshop in New York, Dallas, San Francisco, and London. And then COVID-19 hit and illustrated so many points that I make in that workshop on operational resiliency and more. But I present this slide often in those workshops. And I've been challenged in 2 of those workshops, but in 2 different places, one in San Francisco and one in London. And these 2 different organizations said the exact same thing on this slide. Now, normally how I present this slide is we need to be able to see the tree as well as the forest, that individual third-party relationship and assess that relationship, but the interconnectedness relationship, the forest of relationships, and see risk across those relationships. And everybody loves this slide, but again, I've been challenged on it twice saying that's not quite accurate for our environment. In our environment, it's not just the tree and the forest, it's the leaf and the branch. That we have to be able to understand and manage, say an outsourcer who has, 100 contracts with our global bank. And we need to know that 89 of them touch GDPR information and 11 do not. So we have to manage things down to the contract or service level agreements within these relationships. So it's not just the tree, it's the leaf and the branch. That was like a big aha moment for me because, it was a few years ago, several years ago, that I was actually on the Social Accountability Advisory Board for a global Fortune 100 company in dealing with supply chain code of conduct and international labor standards across 5,000 suppliers and 20,000 facilities in this firm's global supply chain. Now, in that context, they're not just managing things at the relationship level. There's 5,000 suppliers. They're managing things down to the facility level. The 20,000 facilities. One relationship, one supplier might have one facility. Another relationship tree here might have, 20 facilities. And each of those facilities had to undergo an assessment, not just the relationship. And so organizations need to be able to get to not just the tree, the relationship, but be able to do assessments down to the facilities, the contracts and service levels within those relationships as well. But what I see is the inevitability of failure in third-party risk is a lot of documents, spreadsheets, emails, and manual processes. It's like Hercules battling the Hydra. Hercules had many battles to fight. One was against this multi-headed dragon, the Hydra, and you cut off one of its heads and multiple heads grows up in its place. Trying to do third-party assessments in documents, spreadsheets, and emails is a recipe for disaster. It's gonna lead to the inevitability of failure. Things get missed, they slip. They don't get responded to, and you don't have the proper evidence trail. So let's unpack this a little bit. One firm I was talking to was spending 200 employee hours. Yes, 200 hours to build one report for the board of directors. Remember, in some industries, like US financial services with the OCC oversight, the board of directors has oversight responsibilities for vendor risk management, third-party risk. In areas of the world like United Kingdom with UK SMCR, the Senior Managers and Certification Regime, Australia's BEAR regulation, Banking Executive Accountability Regulation, Ireland's SEER regulation, Senior Executive Accountability Regulation, Hong Kong's Managers in Charge regulation, Singapore's proposed accountability regulation. We're seeing a wealth of accountability regulations that put accountability and responsibility, not just responsibility, but actual accountability for risk and compliance, including third-party risk, on senior management executives. One bank at my workshop said that because of UK SMCR, they have a senior management function responsible for third-party risk. If there is lack of due diligence or negligence in third-party risk management, that senior management function can be personally fined. That as an individual, not the bank, the individual, that senior management function has to pay the fine. We're seeing greater accountability and oversight. But the problem with documents, spreadsheets, and emails is they have no evidence trail. I can manufacture, what looks like a good third-party risk assessment and try to, cover my behind, with documents, spreadsheets, and emails. And regulators are rising up to this. I mean, look at the recent Department of Justice compliance, evaluation compliance program guidelines that came out a few months ago that talk so strongly on third-party risk management and third-party compliance. I mean, if you read through that, it's talking about having strong evidence trails of who accessed the system, what did they access. Documents, spreadsheets, and emails don't get you that. And so the regulators and people are picking up, we need strong technology with a system of record and audit trail to show that this history and system of record of these interactions on assessments and said, this person answered this question on this date and time. If somebody came back and modified an assessment answer, who modified it? But right now, as it stands, getting back to where I started, one company I was talking to is spending 200 hours just trying to build a report for the board of directors. And now it takes them less than a minute. But they were spending 200 hours once a year to build a report. And they're finding that was reactive compliance and not proactive. Because they found out that they had an issue that started with vendors 11 months ago and then grew, became a bigger issue, but nobody detected it until one employee combed through all the different documents, spreadsheets, and emails to build one report for the board of directors 11 months later. And they found out they had a big issue at that point. A company I was talking to is managing 5,000 suppliers and assessments to 5,000 suppliers with 1 FTE that one of their competitors requires 6 FTEs. The difference is technology and automation. The one with 6 FTEs is using manual processes with documents, spreadsheets, and emails, while the one with 1 FTE is using technology to automate this. And we need to be able to automate the assessment process for reporting, for the proper system of record and audit trail, and to be able to create greater efficiencies in the organization as well. So we're moving from a past to a future. A past of reactive, ad hoc, siloed manual processes of documents, spreadsheets, and emails to do third-party risk assessments, to a future of automated third-party risk assessments that manage the overall process with technology and the reporting, integrates content information into that from inside out and outside in type perspectives for a more future-focused, proactive management and assessment of third-party relationships. Now let's unpack what I talk about terms. Where we're referencing third-party risk, third-party compliance, where we hear vendor risk, all this. I like to use the term third-party GRC, third-party governance, risk management, and compliance. Now, I was known to be the father of GRC back in my days at Forrester in February 2002 on a cold, snowy day in the Chicago office of Forrester. I defined a model to market for technology and called it governance, risk, and compliance, GRC. And since then, the GRC market's grown. One of those segments is a third-party GRC segment. Now, the official definition of GRC can be found in the OSEG GRC capability model that I helped contribute to. And it defines GRC as the capability to reliably achieve objectives while addressing uncertainty and active integrity in the organization. So the reliable achievement of objectives is the governance function. The risk management is the addressing uncertainty. In fact, ISO 31000 says risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And the acting with integrity is the compliance. Now, I've adapted the broad definition for enterprise GRC specifically to third-party GRC management. Third-party GRC management is a capability that enables an organization to reliably achieve objectives. Think about it. Every relationship you have is there for a purpose. Are we achieving the objectives in the relationship? Are we governing those relationships properly? We can't manage risk without thinking of the context of what that relationship's there for. We have to govern the relationship and define what the objectives are in that relationship, and are we achieving those objectives? While addressing uncertainty, the uncertainty is the exposure in achieving those objectives of the relationship and bringing in other, potential threats and concerns. But then also act with integrity to make sure that we're dealing with businesses that share the same values and ethics and policies and controls that we do in our third-party relationships. So third-party GRC management, which I think is a better term than third-party risk, is a capability that enables an organization to reliably achieve objectives while addressing uncertainty and act with integrity in and across its third-party relationships. Now, organizations need to drive to what I call resilient third-party risk management, or third-party GRC management, as I just made the case. And I just finished a paper that I collaborated and wrote that Prevalent has to be able to discuss this, that talks about the value of an assessment we're getting into now. We need resilient third-party management that delivers lower costs, makes things more efficient, while simultaneously being able to scale the program, reducing redundancy and improving human and financial capital efficiencies. We need resilient third-party management that delivers consistent, actionable, and accurate information. Think about it. If you're trying to manage hundreds of thousands of documents, spreadsheets, and emails for third-party risk, it's not going to be consistent, actionable, and accurate information. You get errors in compiling information and scoring and trying to build that enterprise report on third-party risk. It's certainly not consistent and actionable because it takes you, 200 hours to build that report, and before you start to see insight, and things are already hurting you at that point, and we find out that something has started 11 months ago. We need resilient third-party management to improve decision-making and insight into risk exposure in business relationships, and also resilient approaches to enable the organization to defend itself with an agile third-party risk management program designed to mitigate risk exposure, which means we have to automate assessments in the organization to be able to properly deliver on this. So 9 critical elements that I find in a third-party GRC or risk management program. One is the ability for continuous third-party risk monitoring, to be able to monitor third parties, not just at a point in time, and this is my workshops, I get into this all the time. That part of our challenge is that we just focus on onboarding. We do that assessment, when we start the relationship, and then we go about our way, and years later, we haven't done an assessment since. We need continuous third-party risk monitoring. We're assessing and evaluating those third parties periodically, like once a year, but also on key risk indicators when certain events are triggered. Maybe our competitor has significant data breach and they've been fined and there's been GDPR and CCPA enforcement actions against them. Now we need to want to look at our systems and approaches there in context of the findings of those enforcement actions to see if we have exposure. So there might be key risk indicators that trigger assessments between periodic assessments. But then also be able to continuously monitor third parties. So that we're continuously monitoring their security scores and evaluations, both internally and externally, inside out and outside in. We need approaches to third-party risk that manages risk in proportion of the risk in the relationship itself. The Fortune 100 firm that I was working with on their program, they scored every one of their third parties on a red, yellow, green level. Red level vendors were high-risk vendors that needed more close monitoring, and they actually required an on-site inspection and audit of those vendors every year. Medium risk vendors were, had a moderate amount of risk exposure in the relationship, and they had to do an on-site inspection or audit every 2 years. While low risk, green level vendors, and using a stoplight diagram, red, yellow, green, green level vendors were randomly sampled. Out of thousands of vendors, they might look at 100, green level vendors in a year. And so, but we need to be able to approach our third-party relationships and assessment and evaluation of them in proportion to the risk they bring to the organization. We need to be able to set the tone at the top and ensure that senior management and executives are behind us in our program and are properly supporting that and funding it and are informed. And again, we're seeing this in a lot of regulations, whether it's the OCC requirements in the United States, the UK SMCR, to Australia BEAR, Ireland SEER, Hong Kong's MIC, Singapore's, and more. You want to know who the organization does business with. And so basically categorize your relationships. I mean, you can categorize them in many different ways. One is that risk example, and I used a stoplight example of red, yellow, green just a minute ago, but it also by types of relationship. Vendors, suppliers, outsourcers, service providers, contractors, consultants, brokers, agents, dealers, temporary workers, intermediaries, and so forth. But then there might be, categories within each of those, because there's different types of vendors. It could be an IT vendor. It could be a vendor that's watering your plants or mowing your lawns. So how do you categorize and understand who you do business with and what is the exposure they bring? What's the proper third-party oversight of your program? Because that's going to involve who all is there. Because you want to have 360-degree contextual understanding of risk and assessment of that risk in your relationships. So it means that IT and corporate compliance and ethics and legal and procurement all have to work together collaboratively. And so we need proper collaboration oversight of our program. We have to have defined policies, procedures, training, and communication, such as a vendor or supplier code of conduct, proper security and privacy policies that govern that relationship and the controls. You need defined investigation processes. How are you going to collaborate when there are issues? You might have a great relationship and they're crossing their T's and dotting their I's correctly from like an IT security standpoint or some other standpoint, human rights, or whatever it might be. But bad things still happen. And people make mistakes, or there's a malicious bad apple that gets hired. And so how are you going to collaborate and manage investigations with those third parties? What are the proper third-party controls that are required in the relationships itself, within the ERP systems and monitoring transactions and payments to third parties, and so forth? And have the proper team in place to empower positive change in the environment as well. So this means we need to have a top-down strategy. A top-down strategy that looks at the overall, collaborative approach to third-party risk across the organization with defined third-party management processes, which we'll get into in the next slide, and with the right third-party information and technology architecture to enable this. So looking at that third-party management lifecycle, we need to understand the onboarding from the initial registration of a third party to initial due diligence to contracting, to more detailed and final due diligence, to the final onboarding where they're, attesting to the code of conduct and, taking the initial assessments and exams and whatever it might be, inspections, I mean. And so we have that onboarding phase. We have the ongoing monitoring, where we did an assessment during the onboarding process. Maybe 1 year later, we do an assessment again. Or there's certain triggers during what might happen throughout the life cycle of that relationship that trigger that relationship. You know, when that relationship comes up for renewal, there's further assessment and evaluation. And then we have to have our checklist and approaches to offboarding, you know, because, you know, how do you say goodbye to third parties? And that's one of the areas I see a lot of organizations fail, is mismanagement of the final assessments and making sure that, you know, all our T's are crossed and I's dotted correctly during the offboarding stage on disposition of information, return of company assets, responsibilities past the termination of the contract, and so forth. And throughout this life cycle of onboarding, ongoing monitoring, maintenance and renewal and offboarding, we have to, you know, actively, proactively manage risk and compliance and the performance of the third party, conduct audits, inspections, and assessments, and manage and resolve issues. So we need technology that can provide automation and tracking to enable management reporting. So we're not spending 200 hours to build that report for the board of directors on third-party risk, but it's there at a press of a button. We have that right audit trail that shows who did what, when, how, and why in the third party, and is defensible in court and with the regulators. It has proper workflow and tasks to ensure that nothing's getting missed, that can collaborate where legal and procurement and IT security and privacy can all work together and see their perspectives, and monitor and enforce controls throughout that third-party relationship. It should have a strong third-party information architecture where we can define what are the objectives in the relationship, what are the risks to those objectives, what are the controls governing that third-party relationship, what issues, events, cases, incidents have arisen in the relationship, the roles, who owns that relationship, who's the subject matter expert on specific risks like data privacy risk, IT security risk, you know, bribery and corruption risk, modern slavery risk in the relationship. What policies govern those relationships, from, you know, supply chain vendor code of conduct, IT security and privacy policies, and others. You know, what regulatory obligations flow into that relationship, and where in the organization does this relationship report and is managed? We need a good information architecture to provide 360-degree contextual intelligence on the relationship. But as I stated, what's also key and important is to understand the audit trail and system of record. What assessment was communicated on what date and time to the third party? And what was the evaluation of that assessment at that point in time of the third party? You know, what questions arose from that assessment? Did we meet our regulatory obligations in that assessment? Was there some type of control or policy in that third party relationship that there was an exception to? Was that exception documented? Who approved that exception? You need to be able to have strong auditable system of record on your assessments to be able to defend the organization. So I set a lot of context for what we're going to get into next now. And that is, how do we measure the value of an assessment? Now, when I go about helping organizations build business cases like economic justification of value for third-party risk technology and other areas of GRC, I break it around the angles of efficiency, effectiveness, and agility. The first angle is the efficiency. Time saved, money saved. It took me 200 hours to build just one report once a year for the board of directors. We expect it'll take me less than 5 minutes now. Now you can calculate out a financial and human capital savings easily from there. You know, and you start multiplying that through other reports in the process, from reporting on individual relationships, regional reporting, quarterly, monthly reporting, and you can start getting significant economic savings through automation of assessments and the reporting on assessments. You can measure things like that other firm that I talked to, the energy firm, in which, you know, they were managing with 6 FTEs, 5,000 suppliers, and brought it down to 1 FTE. You know, financial capital, human capital savings in the business case. Effectiveness, you know, more assessments being done, greater accuracy in assessments, greater risk reduction. And how do you calculate that, which we'll get into in just a minute? So efficiency, effectiveness, but also agility. How do you keep up with a changing business environment where not only is our business changing, but our third parties, as well as risks and regulations, and keep our assessments current with the context of business as it is today? Let's face it, assessments of third parties today are different from they were a year ago. COVID-19 has had an impact. And so there's greater focus on some of these assessments on the operational resiliency of the relationships, the security, particularly from, you know, third parties working from home and home offices, we have to keep up with the changing environment and also be greater responsiveness to issues and events in those third-party relationships as well. So we can look at a variety of value dimensions of third-party assessments in building a business case for third-party assessments in our organization. And so here's several qualitative factors that we can explore. And so in those qualitative factors, you have greater integrity in relationships. We have more stable, operationally resilient relationships that actually share the same values on things like privacy that we communicate to our customers and employees, that we share the integrities about the shared values and the application of those values into processes and systems in the organization. So we have the value dimension of greater integrity in our relationships, the value of meeting requirements and avoiding penalties and fines, such as like HIPAA violations, CCPA and GDPR enforcement actions and penalties, and more. Reduction in audit issues and resolving those issues. Being able to have greater assessments means that we're going to find weaknesses and exposure, and they're not going to come up with the external auditors or internal auditors and be bigger issues at that point. We're going to find things early on and contain them and make sure they're addressed, right, even before the relationship started. So reduction in audit issues and resolving issues, and reduction in third-party audits and inspections, because there's greater reliability on the automated assessments themselves. You can have value in the enhanced contract negotiation value. A reduction in the cost of incident and data breach exposure. Streamlined operational costs as we have less resources. Like we went down from 200 hours to build a report to 5 minutes. We went down from 6 FTEs to manage 5,000 relationships, third party to 1 FTE. We have that efficiency savings. Reputational cost avoidance from our stock price tumbling from a data breach or other third party incident, and lost customers and lost business. Efficiencies in internal staff time I've referenced, and also the agility and responsive processes to be more operationally resilient in a very dynamic world that's trying to navigate chaos. So I went about taking a lot of these different points here, and I've been collaborating a lot with Prevalent and some of their customers and putting together an overall model on how do we measure the value of an assessment. And there's multiple dimensions you can measure value with. I can measure, value in a bribery and corruption context, human rights, and like modern slavery issues and child labor and forced labor issues, quality and environmental and health and safety in third-party relationships, operational resiliency in our supply chain and vendors and service providers. But there's so many different angles and aspects. What we did was just pick one of them to build a model out as an example for this particular webinar. And that is the value of an assessment related to a third-party data breach. And how do we measure the risk reduction? So let's explain this. Unfortunately, you'll have to read the accompanying report to this model. And this is the actual table from the report itself. We'll get into a live view of the model in just a second. So you'll have to have the report if you want, because the slides themselves aren't going to do them justice on how to explain this. Because you have multiple factors that go into the cost of a data breach. And as a foundation, I use the data breach cost numbers from the Ponemon IBM study. And the different costs that went into the cost of a data breach was fourfold. The breach of a detection and escalation, so breach detection and escalation, customer and employee breach notification, post-data breach incident response, and lost business and customer trust, which actually accounts for over a third of the data breach costs. 36% of the total data breach cost was lost business and customer trust. So what they found was, with the IBM and Ponemon research, was that 2/3 of the cost of a breach happens in the first year. 1/3 of the breach costs are incurred after that. So 2/3 of the costs can be found in year one after a data breach. And then, so 2/3 there, and 1/3 in the subsequent second and third years. And they also found that breach costs do not scale proportionately with smaller organizations. Small organizations face disproportionately higher breach costs when measured in the context of larger organizations. The probability that an organization will have a data breach over the next few years is roughly 30%. So out of 100 organizations, there will be 30 that have a data breach in the next 2 years. So a critical factor they also found in lowering data breach cost was technology automation. The average data breach costs were 3.92 million for a data breach in general, and that went down to 2.65 million when things were automated. And today we're talking about the automation of assessments. Now, they specifically segmented and looked at third-party breach costs, so the breach that happened from a third party. And so that's where you start to see some of these numbers playing here. So from a third-party data breach, with this same factor for automation, the average cost of a data breach in a third-party relationship was right here. This number here. So using the Ponemon IBM studies, and then the other calculations are my own here too. But you know, the average cost of a data breach, the third-party data breach, went from 3.92 million to 4.29 million. So an internal data breach cost was 3.92 million. A breach in a third-party relationship cost 4.29 million. And so we also found that there's reputational cost avoidance, there's efficiencies in internal staff time, and agility and responsive processes. But we find that if you take these figures here, like 4.29 million, and you reduce them by through the automation, you know, and so you have a level of automation within the third parties that is uncovered in the Ponemon Institute, that with automation, there's a reduction in the cost of a breach. So if you use automation, it goes down from 4.29 million to 2.9 million as a cost. And so if we take the understanding that, you know, we have 1,000 third parties as just an example, and from there, what percent of the vendors are higher risk, that have greater risk of data breach exposure, say 50%, so 500 vendors are our target. Our inherent breach cost of an average cost of a data breach in a third-party relationship across sizes is 4.29. The likelihood that that breach will occur over the next 2 years is 30%, you know, and then the risk exposure, the average cost of a breach times likelihood is 1.287 million. And so divided by the 500 vendors, you know, we're basically getting a risk exposure per vendor of 2,574. Now, using automation for assessments, we still have the same number of vendors, the same high risk percentage. So we're still dealing with 500 vendors that are in scope here. But the cost of a data breach with automation is reduced to 2.9. So if you look at a heat map, you have impact versus likelihood. So we're saying the impact is reduced from 4.29 to 2.9 million. And the inherent likelihood we're estimating is cut in half from 30% likelihood to 15% likelihood, which means an aggregate risk exposure of 435,000, which means that our risk exposure per each of the 500 vendors is 870, which means a risk reduction per vendor through automated assessments is 1,704. So let's take a look at this a little bit further in this particular spreadsheet that we're showing right here. So now this spreadsheet's available through Prevalent. And so in this context, this is a little more dynamic because I took the basic cost of a data breach information from Ponemon and broke it down by size of the organization. So back here, this was just the average size. So the averaging across organizations of all size. So the actual spreadsheet, you know, you can see that the cost here varies. So 25,000 employees, the cost of a breach is 5.11 million, 5,110,000. We go to 10,000 to 25,000, it's 4,350,000. We go to 5,000 to 10,000 employees, it's 4,410,000. You know, 1,000 to 5,000, it's 3.6 million basically. You know, 500 to 1,000 employees, it's 2.6 million. In less than 500, it's 2.7. I mean, these are the actual costs, the average cost according to the survey from IBM and Ponemon on a data breach by company size, with the calculation for a third-party risk data breach based in there, getting us to that figure. And then you can put in your number of third parties and the percentage of third parties considered to be high risk. Those are that are in scope. You know, in that context, You can see the calculations here as it comes out for organizations of different size as you adjust this to the overall value of a risk assessment and how it changes per vendor down below. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to our host. Well, I'd like to finish on this slide here first, but if we automate our third-party risk assessments, it makes for a more agile third-party risk management or GRC program. We're more aware of our risks in the organization. We're aligned across our different departments and functions to see those risks. We're more responsive to be able to identify and contain those risks and contain them so that there's less cost in the breach or whatever risk exposure we're measuring. We're more agile to a dynamic environment that's changing and our third parties are changing, which means we have more operation resiliency in our third-party relationships and become more efficient in our use of human and financial capital resources in our third-party program itself. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Prevalent to get some of their perspective and move into Q&A.
Hey, Michael, thank you very much for that. And hi, everybody. My name is Scott Lang, VP Product Marketing here at Prevalent. I just want to build on some of the concepts that Michael introduced in the bulk of his webinar earlier today. What I thought was, the crux of what Michael shared today were the three concepts of effectiveness, efficiency, and agility in helping to move third-party risk management programs toward greater levels of each of those three, criteria, if you will. And that's what Prevalent seeks to do in helping its customers grow and manage and mature their third-party risk management programs over time, is to improve the effectiveness, the efficiency, and the agility. Next slide, please, Michael. And I think you can really see that demonstrated in our five-step approach to helping organizations grow their TPRM programs from being very reactive to very proactive. And to kind of walk through very quickly the steps involved in this approach is, chances are your third-party risk program is if you haven't had the opportunity to deploy a lot of controls or a lot of automation, you're probably stuck in spreadsheet jail right now. And it's probably resulting in a lot of headaches and a lot of pain, a lot of stress, juggling of emails and spreadsheets and SharePoint and all this other business back and forth with your vendors, which really doesn't lend itself to an effective and efficient or an agile approach. And we find that a lot of customers begin to take that first step toward improving their programs through centralization or managing all of their vendors in one place, programmatically onboarding them and scoring them to come up with some mechanism of inherent risk so they know how to treat them from a risk management perspective. The next step in this maturity cycle, these steps to moving from reactive to proactive is as I said, getting out of spreadsheet jail. Ditch those spreadsheets and begin to automate the process a little bit according to the standards and the regulatory requirements and the security practices that are appropriate for your business, and having solutions in place that help to automate that on your behalf so you don't have to worry about kind of mapping all of that capability together. Third step in the process is all about consuming multiple different feeds, whether it be from cybersecurity feeds and scoring, or business and financial and credit risk monitoring intelligence to help you make more informed and smarter risk-based decisions. It's as Michael said earlier in the presentation, it's more than just periodic internal controls-based assessments, but it's also about filling the gaps between those assessments with this consistent, regular flow of risk data to help provide a richer, deeper score. And once you have greater levels of automation and efficiency and intelligence through this broader ecosystem of cybersecurity inputs, then you begin to be able to automate the process of fixing what's really important to you, or very programmatically defining what remediation looks like, taking advantage of built-in remediation guidance and best practices, for example, on the Prevalent platform, to then reduce your level of risk exposure over time and get to a lower level of residual risk. And I would argue that the apex of any third-party risk management program and its maturity is to get to the point where it's continuous, intelligent, and automated. And that's really, the last step in this path of moving from reactive to proactive. And that's having the intelligence in place and the predictability in place to be very proactive and continuously assess against those vendor risks. And you can see this diagram kind of moves you from, axes of visibility and efficiency, up through maturity from reactive to proactive. But the point in this is, this takes you from a very static point-in-time manual ad hoc process to one that is much more dynamic, real-time, agile, and adaptable over time. And I think that plays very well and very directly into what Michael was talking about in his excellent presentation here. Next slide, please. And that's what Prevalent delivers. Our whole objective is to help you move from point A to point Z in a very programmatic fashion in growing and maturing your third-party risk management program. And we do that through the application of something called the Global Vendor Intelligence Network that first gives you an on-demand access to more than 10,000 constantly updated vendor intelligence profiles to get started with your risk identification, your vendor onboarding process, and more, much quicker than manual methods. Second is to employ vendor risk assessment services. Let us do the hard work for you. We can help you onboard, assess, remediate, and manage those vendors throughout the entire vendor lifecycle, selecting the right assessment for you, mapping that to compliance requirements, helping you produce reporting that gets to the heart of where your biggest risks are. And then finally, when you're ready, you can automate assessments and monitoring for a completely closed-looped 360-degree view of third-party risk by utilizing our platform as a standalone entity. And all of that is fed by that continuous vendor cyber and financial risk intelligence that I mentioned on the previous slide. And at the end of the day, it's all about the benefits you see. And our customers have told us that they can identify risks 44% faster, reduce the manual labor involved in assessing vendors by 50%, and then increase their individual team's productivity by a factor of 3 by utilizing this model. So, I definitely want to, encourage you guys to take the next step, take a look at Prevalent. The next slide, Michael, please. Because, I think we can provide some very programmatic next steps for you to get engaged and learn a little bit more about how we can help you and meet you wherever you're at in your maturity cycle and ultimately help you achieve your program's objective. As we mentioned, as Michael mentioned before, the first step could be potentially downloading the value of an assessment calculator. And I think Peter included a link to that in the Zoom webinar chat. Once you've had a chance to calculate some of that information, maybe schedule a maturity assessment or a strategy briefing with Prevalent where we can help you kind of understand where you're at in that 5-step life cycle, and then engage with a Prevalent resource or an expert to just help you build out this consultative strategy to move from point A to point Z. So, with that, that's all I wanted to share with you today from Prevalent's perspective. I guess I'll probably turn it back over to Peter to see if we have any questions that have come through.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Michael. There are a couple questions. Before I get to the first, I'm going to launch a quick poll here. And so you should see that pop up on your screen. But basically, are you looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program in the next several months? If the answer to that is yes, we'd love to talk to you. If it's no or you're not sure, then just answer accordingly. So the first question we have here, we've got a few, and please enter your questions now in the Q&A section on Zoom if you have any. But Michael, maybe you can take this. The question that it's come in says, when you say cost with or without automation, how exactly does automation decrease the cost? And then they're looking for a couple examples.
Certainly. So to me, automation is going to allow for greater effectiveness and accuracy of information, less things slipping through the cracks. And so our assessments are going to be more insightful and reliable, and they're going to tie in a variety of information from other sources as well, and not just be questionnaires and surveys, so just as Prevalent just acknowledged. So when we take a standard approach to risk, a very basic approach, looking at like likelihood and impact, having better, more accurate assessments and to be able to manage and address risk should increase to some level should decrease our risk exposure as far as impact and likelihood or probability. And so just going back to Prevalent slides here, Prevalent just mentioned how, through the Global Vendor Intelligence Network, the assessment services, and the overall platform, it makes things more faster, reduces labor costs and productivity. Those are elements that can go into that on the effectiveness side, but the overall risk reduction is going to be a lot on that effectiveness piece of it that comes in through automating those areas that Prevalent does right there as well.
Great, thank you. Time for a couple more questions, but again, if you've got any, please enter them. The next one here is, can you describe generally the process you've seen organizations use to move off of spreadsheets and onto a more sophisticated TPRM program, or as you called it, Michael, a third-party GRC management program?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So generally, what process have you seen organizations use to move off of spreadsheets and onto a sophisticated, more automated program? I know it's a big hurdle for some that are on spreadsheets now, but what first steps can they take, or what general process have you seen organizations use?
In my work, in my third-party risk workshops, I define a five-fold process for that. The first one is to understand what your current state is and where you're trying to be. And so how are you doing third-party risk assessments today? Who's all involved? Are they manual, or are there different solutions doing different pieces of it? And then where do you want to be 3 years from now? And then from there, get the right people on the team, select the technology as the third step to get you to the end goal, so you're not finding out that you went down the wrong road and having to replace things further down the road. But step 4, which really hits to it, is take things in stages. If you take it, for example, climbing Mount Everest, you can't just run up Mount Everest. You will die. You've got to get to the first base camp and let your body acclimate to the altitude before your body's ready for the next stage of Mount Everest. And so if you have a large program with a lot of vendors and suppliers, you're going to have to take it in stages, just like climbing Mount Everest. And so that's going to involve understanding where our most critical risk areas are and addressing those first, then go into the more moderate risk areas and things and vendors and addressing that. Because you're not going to just run up Mount Everest, in this context, the mountain of third-party risk. If you have a large program with lots of vendors and suppliers, you've got to break it up and tackle it in stages that can be digestible and achievable.
Good point. Excellent. And I'm not running up Mount Everest anytime soon. All right, so next question, and this may be our last, unless anyone puts anything else in the chat. How is vendor tiering different for a security-specific third-party vendor program when compared to overall vendor risk program? And then what are some things to consider for a security-specific program? And I'll repeat that if it'll help, Michael.
Certainly. I mean, to me, what we want to achieve is a 360-degree contextual awareness of all the risks in a third-party relationship. And so, I mean, you could look at a spider chart or a pie chart or something, and one slice that's going to be IT security risk, another is going to be corporate compliance and ethics risk, another is going to be procurement risk. Under procurement, I mean, you might be looking at financial viability and stability and deliverability of the supplier vendor. Under corporate compliance and ethics, you're going to be looking at, the overall policies, supply chain vendor code of conduct, things like bribery and corruption, maybe human rights and slavery. Under the IT security and privacy element, I mean, you're going to be looking at a lot of the security policies and controls in the relationship and processes in the relationship. So each of those slices by themselves has their own criteria, and we need to be able to understand those areas. But it's also important to be able to get the complete picture of the risk in the relationship as well across the different risk domains and areas.
Excellent. Thank you. So I think we're going to wrap it up here. The only other comment, there's one last question. Just under the wire, we'll come up with one last question. How do you consolidate a vendor risk level based on assessments results, external data? How to consolidate a vendor risk level based on assessments results, external data internation? Is there a formula? I'm not sure if that made sense to you, Michael.
I mean, you're going to find different formulas and approaches within different solutions out there. And so Prevalent has its own way of aggregating risk information across from its network to the assessments and things that are done to come up with an overall risk score. So, I mean, a lot of the vendors and solutions have their unique approaches to be able to aggregate and normalize that type of information for an overall risk score in a vendor. I don't know if there's any standard methodology to do it out there. I haven't seen one.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Just as a reminder, we are recording this session, so we'll send that recording out for you to replay or share with your colleagues. That'll come out tomorrow. And I will also include in that email a link to the spreadsheet that Michael was demoing here. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Michael, thank you so much. Appreciate it. A lot of good, valuable information and some good takeaways. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Thanks.